in Ann Arbor. He graduated from Harvard as an undergraduate. Then Professor Gahn earned his doctorate at the University of Illinois in 2001 in clinical community community psychology. The following year, 2002, he joined the Department of Psychology in the clinical area and the program in American culture, which is, I guess, the equivalent of Native American studies. He's published widely with a variety of journals, including the American Journal of Community Psychology, the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, the American Indian Cultural and Research Journal, and the topics are wide-ranging, believe me. They include mental health, culture, identity, the issues of self and community and healing. And tonight's lecture is entitled Reconsidering American Indian Historical Trauma, Ruminations of a Critical Cultural Psychologist. Please help me welcome Dr. Gahn.
Well, thank you. I'm really flattered that you all were able to pry yourself away from your high-definition TVs from the outcome of the men's figure skating, which I'm kind of interested in myself. But we'll catch up on that later. Tonight it's my privilege to have a chance to talk to you about some things that I've been thinking about for a few years now. And as Bill said in that lovely introduction, you can see that I'm interested in thinking about historical trauma. Those of you who work or are from Indian country have undoubtedly heard this term, and I want tonight to take the opportunity to help us unpack that and examine it perhaps a little more critically than has been done in some instances. But first, let me start just by introducing who I am and telling you a little bit about what I want to accomplish with you tonight. As Bill said, I'm a psychologist by training. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, a research psychologist, but on issues having to do with clinical mental health concerns in Indian country. I'm clinically trained, I'm community engaged, I'm culturally attentive. So depending on the particular context, I will identify either as a clinical psychologist, a cultural psychologist, or a community psychologist. And tonight I think it'll be fine to use any or either of those at any time. So I do study Indian culture and mental health, and in particular I've tried to attend very rigorously and significantly to indigenous psychologies that were quite distinctive in the past and that remain today still distinctive in some important ways as a means of figuring out how best to guide, assist, and promote well-being in Indian country. And in particular, one way we do that in behavioral health and human services circles is through counseling and psychotherapy. I'm someone who's convinced that we need some alternatives to that that are more culturally grounded, so a good part of my work is addressed to why I think that and what I think those alternatives might be. I have a website that you can go to if you want to learn more about me. All of my publications are available for download from there. But tonight, I'm interested in thinking about historical trauma, as I mentioned. We have four goals, really. One is to consider the significance of history for contemporary American Indians, independent of trauma per se, just the significance of history. But then to go on to review this very prevalent discourse throughout Indian country of, historical trauma. It's circulating, it's growing, and I think almost everywhere you go in the United States in Indian country, you'll hear this term used quite regularly. I want to explore several concerns and controversies surrounding this discourse, which I don't think have been as widely circulated or promoted. And ultimately, I want to, at the end, hazard some suggestions for alternatives to use to describe the ongoing legacy of colonization in native lives. And I hope to set up by then a rationale for why I think we need some alternatives to the historical trauma discourse that I'll first explain. So, in talking about historical trauma, historical is probably pretty clear to you. Trauma might be clear to many of you, but let's just be super clear about what we're talking about. I just went to Wikipedia, that wonderful source for getting anything you want at the click of a mouse. And so we have three definitions here from Wikipedia, which I think are all great. The first has to do with serious physical injury, compromise of the physical integrity of the body. And that's the old school definition, trauma. That's pretty much only what trauma meant up until the middle 19th century, the English word trauma. But thereafter it started to shift in meanings to incorporate this second definition of an emotional wound that leads to psychological injury. And this comes about with the birth of a psychological mindedness in the history of English-speaking, the English-speaking world as well. And finally, now an event that causes great distress. The history of the concept is actually reflected in these definitions, as I said. You don't find this shift from physical trauma to psychological trauma until about 1860 or so in Great Britain in the context of rapid modernization and the technologization involving railway construction. So with the arrival of the steam engine and railroads going here and there to transport people, there started to be crashes. And in the context of those crashes, people would be shook up, and they would start to have all kinds of symptoms that were either testifying to maybe brain damage of some kind, but the symptoms seemed to linger on in ways that defied neurology of the day really to explain them. And so it required a sense of there might be a psychological cause for some of the symptoms that lingered on past one's experience of an accident in the railway system. So that's what really heralded this move from physical to psychological inquiry. Now, historical trauma is principally concerned with psychological injury then. We're not really talking about physical trauma. So for the rest of the talk, when I use the term trauma, I'm talking about psychological or emotional damage. This sense of psychological injury or damage was really codified in modern ways through efforts to recognize the deleterious impact of war on Vietnam combat veterans. So as you might be aware of, after Vietnam, there was a mobilized effort to establish post-traumatic stress disorder as a way of talking about a syndrome that many Vietnam vets who returned to the United States from Southeast Asia were experiencing. And by now, I trust it's pretty well circulating in society. Most people have heard of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, but that didn't come about until 1980 when it was first formally included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, version 3, the DSM-3. Of course, war has been a reality of the Rocky Mountain West for some time, well before Vietnam. And to offer an illustrative vignette, I looked for a captivating Indian war story set around these parts. And so I want to start by talking about a narrative from a Gros Ventre woman named Watches All. And Watches All told this story to anthropologist Alfred Kroeber around 1901 when he went among the Gros Ventre to learn something about Gros Ventre ways. And I want to share this because I think it offers a brief American Indian account of potentially traumatizing life experiences that are related to war. It stands out in some ways because it's a story of a woman and her war experiences in comparison to some of the other stories Kroeber gathered from men. Watches All was about age 70 when she told this story in 1901, and the excerpts I'm going to read are about her ultimately being swept up in what was, come to be known as a disastrous expedition by the Gros Ventres against the Piegan in 1867. So let me just read you a couple excerpts here. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's kind of lengthy, but what I want you to be thinking about here is trauma and events that might be potentially traumatizing in the recount of this war story. So Watches All was obviously quite younger than 70 when this event happened. This was 1867 or so, and she had a dispute with her mother, and as a result kind of went off, joined a war party that was heading north to make war against the Piegan. Finally, they approached the Piegan camp, and that's where I'll start here. When we came near, 2 young men killed a Piegan called Sits in the Middle and his wife. Then our party killed 2 more Piegan close by the camp. But as one of the men stopped to strike the fallen Piegan, the Piegan stabbed him in the back over the kidney, making a hole large enough to breathe through. We tied him around with gunny sacks. Thus we killed 3 men and a woman. Then all of the Piegan attacked us. I saw more people than ever before. They came like ants, and the smoke hung as over a smelter. 2 of the Gros Ventres drove all of our party, even the women, against the Piegan to make them fight. A Gros Ventre was shot through the thigh bone and fell from his horse. He struck his crooked lance in the ground and sat there, and all his brothers went there to help him so that he would not be killed so soon. All the Piegan attacked him. Just as one of them dashed up to strike him, he raised his gun and shot him. Another and another came up until he had killed 6. Then he himself was killed. Then some of the Gros Ventres said, "Let us lead them after us. Let us lead them after us from their camp." The Gros Ventres started to run. The Piegan pursued. The Gros Ventres who were mounted ran their horses as hard as they could. They never stopped running, and a great many of those who were on foot were killed. I was riding behind another woman. Our horse stepped into a hole and pitched forward. The woman was thrown off, but I was thrown into the saddle. The horse started up again, but stepped on his bridle, which checked him. A pagan rode up and struck me with his gun. Then he took my wrist, and I dismounted as he did. Another one came, and after striking me too, took off my bead necklaces. The one who captured me took me back as far as from here to the river, about 30 miles. We saw bodies of Gros Ventre as we went back to camp. We came to camp about noon. Everybody struck me. All day they came and hit me, and one man hit me on the forehead and nearly killed me. A pagan woman tied up my head. I wore a fine dress covered with elk teeth. I took it off, and a pagan woman took it away. Then the pagan directed their people to gather all the captives. They asked them if the Gros Ventre had done anything to Sitz in the middle, who had been found in an indecent position with his wife. The captives all said that the Gros Ventre would not do such a thing, and the pagan were satisfied. 8 pagan, all prominent men, had been killed. So she ends up being kept and sort of protected by a particular warrior called No Chief from other people in the camp who wanted to kill her. For example, she continues, in the morning a man rode around the camp crying, "Bring out all the captives, I'll put them on my son's grave." Then the women hid me. The other Gros Ventre captives were also hidden. 14 of them were saved, but 4 were killed. Then they brought all the spoils to the middle of the camp and counted them. No Chief keeps her for a while, and the camp moves. Then we came to the Elk River. Those of you who are from this area, what's the Elk River? Elk River? In these Indian narratives, you've got to know places, because that's sort of what they're about. You notice there's not a lot about time. You wouldn't even know when this is, right? But places matter. Elk River is the Yellowstone, thanks. Where there was an encampment of soldiers. The soldiers tried to persuade the pagan to sell them all their slaves. One pagan rode around the camp crying, "Sell all the slaves, they'll run off anyway, we can't keep them." But at night, all moved away, and none sold their captives. That winter, I stayed with the pagan. So after a year later, basically her mother, who had escaped, had to come back to try to find her, and so she and her mother are both living in the camp at this point a year later. Then this pagan wife of her new husband said to my mother, "You and her daughter are living poorly, you'd better run off." So when I brought back plates which I had been carrying meat on, my mother said she would escape with me that night. She said she'd wait for me all night. She told me to leave my moccasins with her, and I left them. Then my husband whipped me because he thought that I'd run off. He told me not to sleep all night, but to sit up straight. Toward morning, while my 2 sisters slept, I ran out. My mother's waiting for me. We ran to a creek, over the hills and down again. It stopped raining, and soon it became day. We dug a hole, got into it, and hid all day. And at night, we ran on again. Skipping just a little bit farther. Then we crossed Cow Creek at the very mouth, and other side of the stream found a piece of gunny sack. I took this for a robe and gave mine to my mother. We saw another boat going up the river, and my mother wanted us to get on it and go back to Fort Benton, as she wanted to sell me to the whites. Then I held my mother fast in the brush, for I didn't want to go, and said, "There are many pagan women there. We will be known and taken back." I got up my knife and tried to kill my mother because I didn't want to go. Then we followed the Missouri down along the north side during that day. So they follow it for a while. They end up coming to a store or a saloon where they're cared for by Crow women and the white traders. As they're there for some time, they pick some berries and are attacked by a Sioux war party who kills a white man. He was employed cutting wood in the steamboat, she says. He had just shot a bear. They laid this man in the fire and burned him up so that only his legs were found. Finally, she's escorted home by Bull Lodge and his party from this part of the country all the way back to the Gros Ventre camps, where she concludes, "All were glad to see us again." Now, if we think about this particular narrative, again collected in 1901 about events happening circa 1867, and you try to catalog the kinds of potentially traumatic experiences that might be reported here, it can start us on our way to thinking about trauma and historical trauma. So, she's not only a witness to lethal combat, received repeated death threats, violent beatings, prolonged captivity, possible sexual assault. We don't know that, but it could certainly have happened. Dangerous escape over rugged terrain, nearly sold into slavery by her parent, a violent altercation with her mother, and of course enduring deprivation during her period of escape. We wonder what kind of a factor impact might this have had on this particular woman at this point in her life. Now, so far in this kind of report, we're not really talking about historical trauma per se. We certainly are talking about trauma, potentially trauma, but trauma that's more of a personal nature, something that's directly experienced by someone. So although this is a set of personal traumas that happened in a historical period, this is not what really was meant by historical trauma. But it's interesting to note that in my own personal diagnostic interviews with many Northern Plains respondents in reservation samples, I've heard personal narratives, often from women, telling stories that contain some of these exact same kinds of desperate, horrific encounters, including captivity, sexual assault, beatings, and so on. So the fact is that in Indian country, these kinds of personal traumatic experiences have not been unknown for quite some time. The question, of course, is how best to understand and describe the effects of these kinds of traumatic experiences on native lives. And ultimately, that's what historical trauma is trying to do. Well, there are some contemporary discourses about psychological trauma that we want to consider here. And the first, of course, is post-traumatic stress disorder. An established way of understanding and describing the effects of these kinds of experiences on Wachazal or any of her contemporaries today would simply be that she would suffer from PTSD, likely suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what is PTSD? PTSD is an official mental disorder consisting of three kinds of symptoms that develop in response to trauma. And those symptoms fall into three domains: re-experience, like flashbacks or thinking about something all the time when you don't really want to, or beyond re-experience, avoidance, that is anything that reminds you of the trauma or causes distress related to the trauma, you try to avoid or go out of your way to make sure you don't run into or encounter. And arousal, which means that your autonomic nervous system is keyed up. You have trouble sleeping at night, you're hypervigilant, you startle easily, those sorts of things. The duration for these criteria must be at least 1 month to qualify for post-traumatic stress disorder. In other words, it's a lot more common for someone going through a really horrific experience to have those kinds of symptoms maybe in the short term. So it's only understood to require a length of time before it really counts as pathology. And of course, it has to lead to clinically significant impairment or distress. If someone has something like this, but it's not really interfering with their life in any way, it's really not PTSD. And the prototypical forms of PTSD come from the things that you could probably come up with off the top of your head. Combat experience, in part because it came out of the Vietnam War. Rape is another big one, and various kinds of natural catastrophes, a house fire or a tornado, something like that. Now, PTSD itself is a little bit interesting. It was originally considered to be a syndrome of Vietnam veterans. So before it ever was officially endorsed by the American Psychiatric Association by inclusion in its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it was first and foremost an effort by veteran activists, particularly those against the war in Vietnam, to try and get recognition for the kinds of problems that veterans returning from Southeast Asia were experiencing. And one way they talked about this is we need some way to recognize that the problems these veterans suffer are normal reactions to really abnormal circumstances. So instead of recognizing that these are problem people in some way, what we want to do is frame this particular disorder with its links to traumatic experience such that any of us experiencing those kinds of horrific events would likely behave the same way. It's not about them, it's about the experiences they've gone through. And so we need a way to capture that, and PTSD is what we're proposing. It was successful finally in 1980, in part because of the activist movement. They were so effective at their mobilizing that they ended up with one of their own as a member of the DSM work group to try and include this PTSD. The only non-psychiatrist at the time, and didn't even have a PhD, much less a master's degree, the only one to really be on any of these work groups because of how well organized they were. And so now it's currently recognized since 1980. Here, accepted around the world, PTSD is now everywhere and accepted as if it were always just there, a kind of real disorder that we are all subject to, potentially, given the right circumstances. And of course, as you probably can guess, it's frequently tied to claims for treatment or for benefits or for asylum of some kind. In fact, one thing that's interesting about the discourse of trauma itself, going all the way back to the railway accidents, is it's always tied up in claims for redress of some kind. Even back then, it was about, I've been in this accident, the railway company owes me for my damages or for the harm I've suffered or inflicted. So it's always been intersecting, tied together with claims for redress. There is a vast literature, scientific literature and theoretical literature on trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, including some about American Indians. And so let me just review briefly what we know about American Indians and post-traumatic stress disorder. First of all, American Indians experience disproportionately high rates of some forms of psychiatric distress. So alcohol dependence and post-traumatic stress disorder in the very best psychiatric epidemiology surveys are quite high, disproportionately high, compared to adult Americans in general for American Indians. Some studies have found elevated rates of mood and anxiety, substance use, and personality disorders for American Indians. And of course, as you know, suicide, particularly among Indian youth, is just off the charts. And some subgroups of native populations are more at risk than others. Alaska natives are at some of the highest rates in the world, for example. So that's just psychiatric stress more generally. But if we're talking about trauma specifically, Indians are substantially at higher risk for directly experiencing violence and other forms of trauma. In fact, Indians encounter violence more than twice as often as other Americans, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. And this has been demonstrated consistently for Indian veterans, not just in combat, but back when they're at home, the kind of violent stuff they experience. It's been shown for women, for kids, for two-spirit, or gay, lesbian, bisexual Native people. For example, one recent study revealed that among a sample of American Indian women in New York City, 28% reported being physically abused as children, 40% reported experiences of domestic violence, 48% reported being raped, and overall 2/3 had experienced interpersonal violence in their lives. So there's no question that American Indians are substantially higher risk for trauma and its adverse effects. But if PTSD already labels and describes adverse reactions to personal trauma of this sort, why do AI communities, that is American Indian communities, now embrace and promote historical trauma? What is it about historical trauma that gets us some kind of understanding or explanation above and beyond the discourse of post-traumatic stress disorder? Interestingly, mental health researchers and professionals alongside community members have consistently attributed or associated these forms of trauma and distress with indigenous historical experiences of Euro-American colonization. That is, the epidemic of social ills that has plagued Indian country in some places for hundreds of years at this point coincided historically with moments of Euro-American processes of deliberate cultural devastation and all the things that are associated with that. So if you look through history and you trace Indian life, it's obvious that these epidemic social ills came about at the moment of complete dispossession and confinement to reservations and the overwhelming of cultural practices and so on. Indeed, professional and community discourse regarding Native mental health is distinguished really by this emphasis on the impact of colonization and the associated historical consciousness within tribal communities that this has resulted in. So anthropologists have demonstrated among the Lakota, for example, that people there are always talking and thinking about Wounded Knee and about all kinds of other aspects of Euro-American colonization. That in everyday life, that it's on their mind. It's not far from consciousness, that it comes up in conversation, that people make reference to it. So whereas you might think, gee, that's ancient history, that's over a century ago, in Indian life there is a historical consciousness about these kinds of things, such that it's not left in the past in some distant place where it need not intrude on the present. It seems to be right here now. So history looms very large in Indian country, and it leaves a very palpable legacy the colonization has for Native mental health and wellness. I talked about historical consciousness that Laurie Jervis and anthropologists looked at. Les Whitbeck has also examined historical losses among Anishinaabe communities around the Great Lakes, and he's developed assessment measures to ask people, and discovered in assessing these things that Anishinaabe people think about historical losses really often and feel bad as a result of that. So you can measure this and people will tell how often this happens. Now, it's important to acknowledge that the proponents of historical trauma, especially the early proponents, tend to be health and mental health professionals who instead underscore and accentuate the psychological impact and clinical mental health implications of historical trauma. So there might be ways in which to talk about historical consciousness and the ways in which history intrudes in our daily lives. But to frame it in the discourse of trauma is a mental health move. And it's a mental health move because historical trauma comes to us through mental health professionals and researchers. And I'm going to talk more about who they are and what they say in a bit. But the point here is that historical trauma comes to us from people whose work is concentrated in social work, behavioral health, and human services circles. A real recent article by Sotero did a nice job of summarizing historical trauma, and I want to draw here on the 4 assumptions she outlines as undergirding our notions today of historical trauma. So the first is that there are mass traumas that are deliberately and systematically inflicted upon target populations by a subjugating dominant population. This, of course, describes colonization in American Indian contexts, most American Indian contexts. Although we can start to parse words, and we can do that later perhaps, about to what degree this blanket statement would necessarily include all Native peoples. Second, trauma is not limited to a single catastrophic event, but continues over an extended period of time. So the fact that it's not just time limited one time, but in fact it's kind of enduring. Third, traumatic events reverberate throughout the population, creating a universal experience of trauma. And finally, the magnitude of the trauma experience derails the population from its natural projected historical course, resulting in a legacy of physical, psychological, social, and economic disparities that persist across generations. Now, Sotero is writing in public health, so you get a sense then this is in a health context. That's why she's talking about disparities in particular, because health disparities is a field of interest for now. On the basis of these assumptions, historical trauma is frequently characterized as a variant or extension of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we've talked all about that, but let's talk about what historical trauma proper does to augment that. Standard PTSD, as has been pointed out, does not capture aspects like the mass quality of, say, colonization, the shared aspect of it. So it leads to proposed variants of PTSD that haven't quite made it into the official diagnostic manual yet. Complex PTSD, some people refer to these, or disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified is one way that people talk about these. What do you do when it's outside of, like, your house burning down, or maybe you're raped? But what about these kinds of things that happen to your entire community, and they happen over periods of time, and there's a whole bunch of them at once, and there's no recovery from it, or seemingly no recovery possible from it? So historical trauma is meant to designate these horrific historical events, and it's really modeled on the Jewish Shoah, or Holocaust, as we sometimes refer to it. Therefore, it has this distinctive emphasis on the collective, the intergenerational, and the cumulative effects of these kinds of events. Collective, meaning that these are shared experiences, sometimes of genocidal events like the Shoah was. It's intergenerational in the sense that risk for problems is passed down somehow from earlier generations. And finally, it's cumulative. That is, risk increases with subsequent stressors over time. So if you were someone who experienced trauma A in your life, the fact that you had parents or grandparents who had gone through one of these kinds of things, presumably your risk for trauma A is actually more than it would be for someone who didn't have that historical trauma being passed down in that way. So these proponents of historical trauma tend to think of this as a distinctive Native American Holocaust. They'll use the term Native Holocaust, although I think we should probably find a better word. For one thing, Holocaust actually means burning, as some of you who read the Catholic Bible would know. And so because of the nature of the Shoah, that made some sense, but I don't think it makes so much sense here. So, what is historical trauma? In contrast, then, to personal experiences of a traumatic nature, the concept of historical trauma calls attention to the collective and intergenerational accumulation of risk for adverse psychological outcomes for Native people that originated from the depredations of past colonial subjugation. What do I mean by past colonial subjugation? We're talking military conquest, epidemic disease, forced relocation, reservation captivity, religious suppression, resource theft, environmental degradation, family disruption, government dependency, coercive assimilation, and enforced poverty. Now, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, professor of social work at Columbia University, Ed Duran, a psychologist who's soon to be arriving in Bozeman, Montana, and Bonnie Duran, who's a professor of public health at the University of Washington, are really the three people who've most brought historical trauma into the limelight in Native America. And they've written a bunch of stuff where you can find, particularly Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart has a number of articles and chapters about this. So, looking at Maria's work in particular, historical trauma is again modeled after a certain clinical literature that attests to the adverse psychological effects of the Shoah for Holocaust survivors, but not just for survivors of the Holocaust directly, but for their offspring as well. In other words, she was inspired by this usually psychoanalytically driven clinical literature that showed that above and beyond their own personal experiences of stress or adversity or even trauma, that the sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors somehow had higher reactions than you would expect based upon their own personal experiences. So this is what came to be known as, in psychoanalytic circles, as secondary traumatization. So primary traumatization is when you or I have a horrific event in our own lives and we react to that. Secondary traumatization is when our reaction to whatever goes on in our own life is actually increased or augmented by the fact that our parent or our grandparent had some horrible thing happen to them. So secondary traumatization involves an increase in our distress reaction based on the experiences of our parents. Thus, as a consequence of European colonization of the Americas, Native peoples today are presumed to suffer not just from primary traumatization, although as we've seen, that's off the charts, right? But also from secondary traumatization. That is the cumulative intergenerational transmission of risk for adverse mental health outcomes above and beyond one's individual risk factors, stemming from, and these are the words used in this literature, the historical trauma response, historical unresolved grief, or a soul wound that is passed down from earlier generations. These reactions, described as, quote, collective and compounding emotional and psychic wounding, are said to include many of the symptoms of complicated bereavement and complex PTSD, exacerbated by the loss of cultural practices that were designed to help people cope with these kinds of difficulties. And according to Braveheart and the Durans, if unaddressed or unresolved by therapeutic means, broadly construed, not necessarily counseling, but therapeutic means of some kind, healing, historical trauma is understood to compound over time and carry forward to afflict successive generations of Native people. So the idea here is if you don't deal with this, it gets worse. And if it gets worse, you pass it down. And if you pass it down, not only are you passing this kind of risk down to your kids, who are going to have worse outcomes than you, it's compounding along the way, so it's worse and worse and worse with every generation that comes along, if you don't deal with it. As a clinically relevant concept, then, Native American historical trauma has proliferated widely throughout human services during the past 15 years. Now, this is a select audience, I know, but can you raise hands? Who's heard of historical trauma prior to coming to this particular thing? Yeah, pretty much all of you, or certainly a majority of you. And if you read any of the literature on this kind of stuff, you're going to find things. Yeah, we'll wait till after. Let's wait till after, please. Thanks. Okay, so what's wrong with historical trauma? Many Indians in the human services wish to see historical trauma enjoy the full legitimacy in the human services that they feel it's entitled to. But historical trauma really has a ways to go if it's to become more than a folk discourse and instead achieve bona fide professional status. Now, before I go into some concerns I have about historical trauma, I want to acknowledge a few things up front. First, I certainly recognize that the potential promise of framing Indian distress in historical terms is very valuable. That is, I know that history matters to Indians today, and I know that history has included many horrific things that we need to make sense of today. So I'm not denying that there's a link from historical to contemporary experience, and that link can play out in mental health or behavioral kinds of circumstances. In particular, it does a few things, this notion of historical trauma, that are also potentially valuable. By couching one's distress or disorder or experience or dysfunction, however you think about it, in terms of the context of colonization, going back generations, this has the effect of neutralizing a kind of pathological paralysis that might set in distressed community members by helping to reframe and contextualize personal distress as stemming from shared historical oppression rather than personal failure. So it serves this potentially important function of getting us outside of blaming ourselves for things that we've been experiencing, going through, and done as a result, and helping to tie our experience back in with other people in our community and with other people in the past. So it helps us reframe these things in a way that might actually break through a paralysis and allow us to seek healing. Second, it also provides an alternative explanatory framework that frankly counters the heavy biological reductionism in psychiatry, which has trickle-down effects throughout all the mental health professions. And so there's a way in which this is moving into the historical, into the spiritual, into existential kinds of concerns over time, and it's countering, what we could do instead is look at what's wrong with people's brains or what's wrong with people's genes in the way that a lot of psychiatry does. But this discourse helps to move away from that, so I think that that's valuable as well. And my sense is that appreciation for these advantages is really widely shared by Native allies and advocates within the helping profession. And yet I want to briefly now, in the time that we have left, offer 4 critiques of historical trauma before tracing out a series of next steps that proponents of historical trauma might take to think about all of the impact of history in a little different manner. Now, there's no time really for more than a select introduction to 4 different areas of critique, and there's lots of other ways that you could do this, but I'm choosing to focus on the following 4 things. First, I want to argue that historical trauma follows too closely in the footsteps of PTSD. Second, I want to argue that historical trauma remains vague about mechanisms of intergenerational transmission. Third, I want to argue that historical trauma subjugates evidence of resilience. And fourth, historical trauma is too firmly grounded in clinical intervention. That is, it participates in what I'll describe as medicalization of the social. And I'll explain what that is when we come to that. So, 4 critiques. The first, I think, is that historical trauma follows PTSD too closely. That is, basically, historical trauma inherits some of the problems of PTSD. Which, as you know, is accepted and circulated around the world and is considered a real thing now. But there are some problems with it. And the first of those is that you might recall that PTSD originally was established as a way to characterize the experiences of these Vietnam veterans as having normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. The idea was that any of us who were in horrific combat or had any of these kinds of events happen would likely react in just the same way. But now scientific studies have shown that in fact there's almost no traumatic event class that human beings experience where even the majority of people go on to have PTSD. That in fact it's the exception rather than the rule, that most people experiencing these horrific things go on to have PTSD. So that in some ways undermines the potentially noble goal of those proponents early on. Second of all, we're not sure that PTSD is a truly distinctive pathology. There's been historical resistance to it ever being incorporated into DSM to begin with because prominent psychiatrists at the time felt like all the problems of Vietnam veterans returning from the war could be subsumed under existing DSM disorders. There was no need to tie it all together in this new one because you could have substance abuse, you could have depression, you could have anxiety problems that weren't PTSD to begin with. And PTSD has a high comorbidity. That means that you don't just get a diagnosis of PTSD, it also comes with a diagnosis of another kind of mental disorder. Depression, for example, substance use, for example, or other kinds of anxiety disorders. So it's about 90% of people with diagnosis of PTSD also have diagnoses of these other mental disorders, which is exactly what these early proponents were kind of arguing would happen if it was created. The third thing is that it's not clear whether it's best thought of as an anxiety disorder or a dissociative disorder. Anxiety, of course, is when our autonomic nervous system kind of overrides our ability to live our lives. Panic attacks would be a good example when they're really debilitating, or worrying so much that you can't really live your life right. People who are claustrophobic or agoraphobic or different kinds of phobias that you've heard of. PTSD is currently classified as an anxiety disorder, but going back throughout the history of how trauma has been understood, it has a very close tie to dissociation as well. Dissociation has to do with a kind of fragmenting of mental processes or a disintegration of mental processes such that we have an unconscious mind, Freud postulated, and when certain events were too overwhelming for us, we might repress those experiences by forcing them down into the unconscious mind where we couldn't think of them or be bothered by them every day. And yet there they were underneath in this area of the unconscious and continuing to afflict us with problems that we couldn't really see or deal with because we weren't very aware of the source of our problems being submerged in our unconscious. So dissociation is those kinds of things. The flashback is an example of the dissociative aspect of PTSD, where suddenly you feel like you're living back in the moment and it's almost like if you're back in combat for a Vietnam veteran. something's going on with memory and with processes of consciousness that's not normal there. Or psychogenic amnesia, which is associated with PTSD, that you just can't remember. You blotted out certain horrific aspects of your own experience. And it's not just that you forgot, it's sort of a motivated forgetting to try and cope with the distress that it brings about. So dissociation plays an important role, especially in history. And yet dissociation has not fared so well in modern psychiatry. The key dissociative disorder is known as multiple personality disorder, or now dissociative identity disorder. You know, Sybil, Three Faces of Eve, and there was a whole rash of this in the 1990s, presumably stemming from satanic cult abuse. Of course, the FBI has never found even one documented instance of satanic cult abuse, but there were thousands of women around the country getting therapy for repressed memories of satanic cult abuse. So there's ways in which dissociation has been heavily tainted and really is off the radar for psychiatry today. So I'll stop there with the problems of PTSD, but it follows PTSD too closely, I think, and inherits a lot of these problems that have yet to be resolved. Historical trauma proponents then, along with PTSD advocates more generally, will need to address these complicated questions. Great. Next, we have vague mechanisms of intergenerational transmission. There's a sense of intergenerational transmission of trauma that's completely mundane that we all already know and accept. We know and accept, for example, that if you beat your kids, some of those kids will grow up to beat their kids. Right? We know and accept that if we're substance abusers and we raise our kids, some of our kids are going to grow up and abuse substances. Right? That's a sense of intergenerational transmission of risk that is mundane, that no one says is really requiring great intention or explanation. But the intergenerational effects in the context of historical trauma are usually construed in much more captivating terms, as I said. That is, whether risk for pathology is raised for one's offspring independently of troubling first-hand experiences of their own. So if I'm abused as a child and I grow up and I beat my own kids, they have a traumatic experience and they might develop PTSD from that. That's not so breathtaking or mind-altering. That stands up to common sense. But if I grow up as an abused child, I work really hard not to abuse my kids, but somehow they end up with risk for post-traumatic stress related to some other kind of maybe much more mild trauma as a result somehow of my own abuse as a child, then that's interesting. And that's the claim of historical, that's the claim of secondary traumatization. Now, this intergenerational risk for historical trauma of this sort, the secondary traumatization, is again based on this psychoanalytic literature with Holocaust survivors. And the literature seems to show that these survivors' children were seen to be at increased risk for post-traumatic pathologies, even though they didn't have very many direct traumas of their own. That's secondary traumatization. The problem with this is that there are real limitations in this literature. First of all, so that's why Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart kind of got this idea and started to promote this among Indian communities in a form that we call historical trauma. The problem is that that literature deals with clinical samples. That means it's people who are sick or ill. They have mental health problems. And it's really risky to only study people who are sick and then try to come up with notions about how general functioning works for human beings. And that's a mistake that's made here to the degree that one of the best meta-analyses of the psychological functioning of the offspring of Holocaust survivors was done in 2003 by Van Ingenhorn. 4,500 offspring of Holocaust survivors were studied, and this meta-analysis showed actually they're not less well adapted than anyone else. So there doesn't appear to be any extra risk that they're incurring for through secondary traumatization or any other kind for any kind of mental health problems. And even if there were, it's not exactly clear from these proponents of historical trauma what is the mechanism for this transmission then? What is causing the fact that I don't abuse my kids but I was abused for them to be at risk for trauma as a result of that? And there are some popular mechanisms that are promoted, like maybe the narratives I tell. Maybe if I tell my kids about how I was abused as a kid, that traumatizes them. I heard some folk colleagues today talking about not secondary traumatization, but secondary trauma. And I think they meant that you can traumatize vicariously, if you will, just by narrating and talking about your own trauma in particular instances. Or they've suggested maybe it's genetic. Somehow our trauma experiences are coded in our genes, and that those genes are passed on in some way. Or sometimes they'll say there's a spiritual process at work that we can't really understand, that science probably will never be able to explore. My only point is that historical trauma proponents will need to specify mechanisms of secondary traumatization in testable ways, or else simply retreat to the more ordinary sense of intergenerational trauma if we're really to accept this kind of claim. Third, and probably more important than these other ones, to me anyway, is that historical trauma participates in what I'll call the subjugation of resilience. The original motivation for historical trauma, as you'll recall, was to contextualize personal distress as shared post-colonial disruption. To not make it about you and what's wrong with you, but to recognize that an entire people, an entire community have been impacted in these ways. And so instead of wallowing in blame or guilt or shame or whatever it might be, let's as a people figure out how to heal, recover, and come through this. A normal response to abnormal circumstances, as I keep saying. But paradoxically, the emphasis on collectivity in historical trauma actually ends up essentializing Indianness in a way that suggests that all Indians everywhere suffer from historical trauma, or would be expected to suffer from historical trauma. That is, it obscures terrific diversity in Indian navigations of Euro-American colonization. There are peoples, of course, who suffered massacres at the hands of the U.S. Army. There are lots of peoples, like my own, who never had one altercation with the U.S. Army. Is it really the case that if you have a wounded knee versus, say, like the Crows, you scouted for the Army in a way that protected your own community interests, that you would have the same degree of historical legacy resulting from that? It seems unlikely that tribes in the East who virtually are gone, or they're recomposed in ways that are quite interesting, who never had a colonization experience in 400 years, would have the same risk for historical trauma that peoples on the Northern Plains did, who were, living the nomadic life all the way until virtually almost into the 20th century. So there's great diversity in how tribal nations have navigated colonization, and yet this notion of historical trauma among Indians kind of obscures all of that. It also obscures American Indian intrafamilial well-being, despite presumably equivalent degrees of historical trauma. So an Indian family with the same, kids with the same two parents presumably have the same risk from historical trauma that's coming through the generational transmission of it. And yet, as we know in Indian families, some kids are, dead by 25 or 30 and have all kinds of problems and never pull it together. And some kids go off and really rock your world with how resilient they are. It's amazing. You kind of wonder, wow, where did that come from and how did they do it? In the same family, you've got siblings who diverge in that way. Historical trauma has no room for that. Can't even account for that because presumably they're all at the same risk for these kinds of impacts. And finally, it obscures great diversity in individual Indian ancestry for mixed heritage peoples. And frankly, almost all of us are mixed heritage, whether it's within Indian or Indian and something else. But are you telling me if I have a white parent and a native parent, so is my risk in half? What if I have a Lakota parent and a Gros Ventre parent? The Lakota has this history of wounded knee. The Gros Ventres have no altercations with the Army. So how do I figure out my risk based on that? Or what if we go back to peoples who claim descent from, I don't know, the Shinnecock or these northeastern peoples where this stuff is way, way, way back, and where they've intermarried for so long that if you had a blood quantum requirement, there wouldn't be any tribal members, right? So in that sense, this kind of diversity cannot be accounted for in this discourse of historical trauma either, at least in the way that it's talked about and promoted in Indian country. So my concern about all of this is simply that historical trauma ultimately subjugates remarkable traditions of resilience to this discourse of universal Indian pathology. Let's not be at all unclear here. To be traumatized is to be sick. To be traumatized is to experience a pathology, to be ill. Okay? Basically, by endorsing this notion of historical trauma and saying all Indians have it or are at risk for it or inherit some degree of it, we're ultimately drawing everyone's attention to the fact that Indians are ticking time bombs, waiting for distress, breakdown, dysfunction, and disability, And in the virtual act of directing attention in that way, we completely transfer our gaze away from the remarkable stories of resilience that each of our families, many of our families also have. So while we have family members who, are train wrecks and no one knows what to do to help them, and it's pathetic and pitiful and sad, heartbreaking, tragic, we also have family members where you're like, my God, that's the most inspiring thing I've ever heard. And those are not the stories that get told if you're thinking historical trauma and focusing on historical trauma. And that is a loss because it distracts our own and everyone else's attention from what protects and promotes well-being in the face of great cataclysm. That's what we want to know. That's what we need to know. Finally, historical trauma is too firmly grounded in clinical intervention. As I've said, historical trauma has been adopted and promoted by mental health professionals. Indeed, in some very important respects, historical trauma originates from psychoanalytic clinical practice, and as such, it has the potential to affect this medicalization of the social. Medicalization of the social is a term sociologists have come up with, and some psychiatrists and others have used it. Alan Young, for example, uses this to talk about PTSD in veterans. Medicalization of the social is this. It's a conceptual sleight of hand, or perhaps a sleight of mind, in which attention is displaced from unjust and oppressive social relations in need of radical reform to the difficulties of deficient individuals who instead require clinical management and attention. Taking our gaze away from unjust social structures and focusing on individuals who we can tinker with to try and change. There's an old Jedi mind trick, what critical theorists would call mystification, that serves the status quo. It basically redirects our gaze away from the depredations of colonization, some of which are ongoing today, to clinical conundrums that need to be resolved through more cultural competence. So instead of radical social change, like eliminating poverty, creating jobs, trying to find some way for economic self-determination in Indian country, and changing the structures in the United States of America that continue to reinforce that poverty in some kind of enduring way, we get a cottage industry of counselors and therapists, most of whom in Indian country are paid from government monies, whose job is to tinker with the attitudes and behaviors of individual Indians, most of whom in Indian country are not really obtaining treatment by choice, toward better accommodation of an unjust society. The end result is that we blame the victim. Do we mean to blame the victim? No. Did Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and Ed and Bonnie Duran mean to blame the victim in coming up with this? No. But you can't have a clinical frame of reference around these issues and not ultimately blame the victim. I think with a little bit more imagination, we can do better than historical trauma. So, if not trauma, what instead? This is the part where I have to disavow that I have the answers. So this is the part where I'd like to say, okay, I'm going to tell you some things I've been thinking, but then I'll shut up. It'd be nice to have a conversation about this. I'd kind of like to learn from other people who are thinking about this, what ideas you have, because I don't think I can come up with this, certainly not on my own. But just by virtue of showing you some things I'm thinking about, I'll start by saying that I think what is entailed will be both a shift in language and a shift in actions. Now, I'll draw my shift in language from the work of anthropologist Terry O'Neill. Some of you may know her. She worked in Salish Kootenai for a number of years, probably back before, in the 1990s, or maybe late 80s. Terry O'Neill wrote a book called Disciplined Hearts, which is about depression. And Terry O'Neill's interest was taking DSM psychiatric notions of depression and trying to juxtapose and compare those with local Salish traditions or understandings of depression, and to see how they mapped onto each other. And in doing so, she found really that there were three different kinds of subclasses of experience among the Salish that overlapped with what we would call clinical depression in psychiatric terms. Now that's a little bit beside the point, but I want to draw on this a little bit to show you how language matters a great deal. Because two of the classes of Salish depressive syndromes that she found were referred to by her as feeling bereaved and feeling aggrieved. The third one is feeling worthless, but we don't need to talk about that. I'm just drawing on the first two here. And I want to invite you to consider the difference between just these labels of a person who's traumatized versus a person who's bereaved versus a person who's aggrieved. And I want to ask you what the implications are for what this kind of person is and what this person is about, what this person needs or does in response to living out this label. And I want to suggest here that traumatized makes you sick, vulnerable, ill, weak, very fragile, easily overwhelmed, and in need of treatment, healing, rehabilitation. Feeling bereaved is different. I don't think most of those things when I think of someone who's feeling bereaved. I think a bereaved person might need comfort, might need support, might need encouragement, and might need company. But I assume that bereavement has a way of working out over time, and that whatever is going on there is probably a natural response to something. I say natural. Let me back up. It's a scripted response, a culturally scripted response to a loss or a death, in a way that we expect will resolve under most normal circumstances. It requires a different reaction than if someone is traumatized. Finally, feeling aggrieved requires a different reaction altogether. People who are aggrieved, depends on whether you agree with the reason for them being aggrieved. But let's say you could be persuaded that there's reason for grievance, as there might be in native experiences of colonization, especially the ways social structures endure today resulting from that. Well, then you might think about how could such a person come to find justice? How could such a person work to achieve a healing of relationships and a repair of the social fabric? So these are different labels, just labels, but they have huge connotations for how we think about what human beings are and do. And I want to suggest that we think seriously about shifting our language away from trauma, the traumatic, the traumatized, maybe to some other examples like this, or something else. But this is what I was thinking, having read O'Neill's book. Finally, in addition to a shift in language, I think it requires a shift in action. And this is the most, idiosyncratic. This is just stuff I could come up with. So the first thing we need to recognize is what kinds of shifts in action would it entail? Well, that's not for any one person to say, for everybody. Different communities and different people would make different choices around this. But in terms of just thinking off the top of my head of what kinds of things could I imagine in terms of shifts in action that would help us to deal with the legacy of colonization, which was historical but has contemporary effects in ways that don't involve, this discourse of trauma. Well, I would say, first of all, let's pursue justice and let healing follow. Because, it's not entirely clear to me that you can get healing in the absence of justice. So, you might be able to, you can medicate people. There's lots of things you can do to anesthetize people, or to corral people, or to keep people at bay, or to manage people. But absent justice, I don't know if it's really healing. And so I worry that we might have the cart backwards, and that the efforts ought to go into pursuing justice, and that if justice can be realized even in little steps, I wonder if healing won't follow to some degree. Second, as I said already, I think we really need to identify, examine, and promote resilience. In fact, we need to dissect resilience. Instead of studies about historical trauma, we need studies about, in Indian country, how people come out of the same lives of poverty and disruption and the kinds of things that some Indian families experience, and thrive anyway. And there are people like that on every reservation in every town in the state. But we don't know their stories, and we don't really understand how they were able to do that. But we desperately need to know how, because then we might be able to develop ways to promote and facilitate that so more people are able to be resilient in the face of the kinds of setbacks and challenges we're talking about. Third, I think build something productive. That is, there's a lot of things that one can do that don't actually contribute or change anything, or don't contribute and change anything in a positive, I don't mean happy, but I mean productive manner, in a way that evokes or elicits consequences that have an impact for the better. So rolling up sleeves, getting busy, and trying to do something for making things better are what I have in mind. And finally, making space for the company of others. Because, in American society, less so in Indian country, but in American society, the way individualism works is that there's a lot of people with great ideas who think that they can lead the charge or they're the ones who know. Indian country doesn't have that same kind of problem. But making space for the company of others is something whereby social relationships and the sociality, the sociocentrism that characterizes Native, or once characterized Native community life and still does, certainly in more degrees than in modern America, needs to be a part of this solution as well. So these are my thoughts, offered hopefully in good faith to help us to think about these things. And my suggestion is that we take maybe a half hour or so to talk together about how we might undertake this work together. Thank you.